Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to SunoikisisDC Digital Classics Summer Term 2022. This is our second session of this semester, and today the topic is, text. Let's start with text reuse, because today we will talk about a specific case of text reuse for historical languages, as you know, and specifically for ancient Greek. But for people without a knowledge of ancient Greek, so don't worry, don't leave the session, you can follow us, because we will have translations, and in any case we will present this problem not only specifically for classical languages and for ancient Greek historiography, but in general as a problem of text analysis and text reuse detection for, of course, historical languages. And specifically today, we also have a specific title today, which is Text Analysis and Fragment Detection in Aelianus, the Natura Animalium. And today we will see who was Aelianus, and we will have more information about his work. Also, you have the class outline in GitHub with a full description of the session, links, bibliography, etc. But today, let's say the speakers are Gabriel Bodard, Alexandra Trachsel, and myself, because I have been working also on fragment detection. So we will present this problem, but today we also have two other guests, Lucia Rodriguez and Aelian Berti. So we thank both of them for joining us today, for enriching the discussion, and both are classicists but also expert of digital humanities, textual analysis, so they will help us in our discussion for both aspects. So Lucia, Aelian, thank you very much for joining us today, and of course a great thanks also to our audience. But I think we can start, because today we have really many things to say, and I think that we can start with Alexandra. Okay, Alexandra Trachsel, she's she is from Hamburg, and she works also in Erfurt, and she's an expert of text reuse and fragmentary text, as we call them in classics, and she's working on the text of Aelianus. So Alexandra, I think you can start your part. And you have to unmute yourself, because I can't do that. Alexandra. Oh, okay, excellent. Yes.
So now getting at the beginning of the slides.
Yes.
Is it fine like that?
Yes, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so I start by thanking you and to have invited me to join the session and to present Aelianus, a rather unknown and surprising text. I will just give a few words of the introduction, how it will be outlined. First, I will speaking for 2 points, present Claudius Aelianus and how digital humanities method can help to analyze this text. And then we have 3 other points: text analysis, and then there will be some exercises with the Wire tool, and finally text reuse detection, and a big discussion where our 2 invited guests will also join us and answer questions also from the public. I start with Claudius Aelianus and tell you first who he is. Claudius Aelianus is an author from the later part of the Greco-Roman antiquity. He's dated at the beginning of the 3rd century CE, which means at the time of after the biggest extension of the Roman Empire, when it had become a culturally mixed and open space where people moved for several reasons and could have more than one home. This also meant that the emperors themselves did no longer come from the Latin central part of this huge political entity. And indeed, during Aelianus' lifetime, the emperor came from the oriental part of the empire, from the part which is nowadays referred to as Syria. This brought some difficulties as the new traditions and behavior that this emperor brought to Rome were difficult to be accepted in the more local Roman culture of the political center. This part was still based on political and cultural institutions that took their origin in the old Latin tradition of governance and moral values. This is insofar important for our authors, as he seems to be among those who strongly reacted against one of these foreign emperors. And this is also the most important element that allows us to date Aelianus. Another element we know about the life of our author is the place where he lived. This is my second point on the slide. He came from Praeneste, a small town in the south of Rome, so that his hometown was very close to the political center of the empire. He seems therefore to belong to the old primary part of this huge empire, and he also states several times in his text that he is a Roman and that he claims that Latin culture is his own. Nonetheless, and this is one of the important points about these authors, despite being profoundly bound to his place and mindset of origin, he widened his horizon through his extensive readings. In doing so, he takes a very interesting because contradictory position. He pretends to have never left his hometown and therefore kept to his local attachment. But he put all his efforts in opening his mind to the entire known world through his reading and through the work he composed. Second, because of this stance, there is another highly interesting characteristic of this man. He decided to leave his first language, which certainly was Latin, as a citizen of Praeneste, to compose his work in Greek, which was by then the intellectual and cultural language of the elites. Therefore, we have works from an author who deliberately chose an intellectually significant language to compose his work and to demonstrate in doing so how it was possible to take part mentally in the entire known world by still being profoundly attached to his own local identity, which makes him, to my mind, a very contemporaneous author. Now, as I said, the work he composed were written in Greek, and we have kept 3 of them. The first is a huge collection of short and unconnected anecdotes about animals, their behavior, their anatomy, and their interaction with each other and with human beings. Conventionally, it is alluded to by the Latin title De Natura Animalium, which came from the medieval manuscripts. But there is also a Greek title, Περιzoon idiotetes, which can be found in the ancient witnesses speaking about the works by Aelianus. Finally, there are also now, since translation in modern languages exist, versions of the title in each of the modern languages. For English, most of the time, the title is rendered as On the Characteristics of Animals. As you will see, this is an issue, multiple titles or multiple versions of a title, when dealing with works like those of Aelianus in a digital environment, and we will come back to this later. The second work is a similar text, again a collection of a large number of anecdotes, but the content is less focused on animals, and it becomes even more to summarize the content. It is a collection of any piece of knowledge that might have seemed interesting to the author at some point during his readings. However, in the form we have it today, it is much smaller than the De Natura Animalium. Indeed, it seems to have been transmitted in a shortened and summarized version that shows the work of a later reader who selected and reworked the original text with its own agenda. Nonetheless, the work's title illustrates the nature of the work. It is a miscellaneous collection of all sorts of informations. Finally, there is a collection of fictive letters, which Aelianus writes taking the stance of a peasant in an agricultural setting. Here again, we have the different version of the title. So why this work still matters for us today? First of all, as far as the first two works are concerned, and especially the De Natura Animalium, which will be at the center of our session, there are huge collections which are composed of extracts from other works from antiquity. It is therefore a very large container of all kinds of lore and pieces of knowledge from antiquity. Aelian states several times, and he is also proud of this, that he presents the fruits of his extensive readings. We have to imagine the author reading through all kinds of books that were available to him, and in this period of the Roman Empire, there existed many large libraries, either public or private, where one could find, if one got access to them, a tremendous amount of old and rare books. We have therefore to imagine this period of the Roman Empire as a very bookish time, where literature was very much present in everyday life. Aelian answered to this wealth of book by creating his works. He claims that they provide an easier access to a huge amount of knowledge that would not have been possible to access otherwise. He takes therefore the role of a mediator of knowledge who aims to give access to knowledge to a large group of people who would not have neither the leisure nor the means to do so. His works are therefore a kind of link between an immense treasure of knowledge accumulated over centuries and the challenge his fellow scholars and future readers faced to access all this information. And we know now by today what the difference it is to accumulate or store knowledge and to find a means to navigate through such large storage spaces. For us today, this means that his work represents a unique access to a great variety of text, or more generally speaking, of pieces of knowledge from antiquity that would have been lost otherwise. Moreover, and this is a further point of interest in his work, he is proud to tell his readers where he took the information he transmits from. So his collection of anecdotes are full of quotations from previous texts. This means that his work not only transmits content that would have been lost, but also where this piece of information were found and who was responsible for their first utterances. Indeed, he composes his anecdotes most of the time by introducing the piece of knowledge he wants to tell as an utterance from another authority who he names. He may add a comment or a judgment of his own while composing the textual sequence which makes the anecdote, but in doing so, he also enters in dialogue with the quoted authority. For us, this means that we have two kinds of information in his work. First, we have access to his readings, and second, to the authors whose work were available in his time. Most of these authors are lost, and we have only knowledge of them because Aelian mentioned parts of their books in his own collections. There are over 2,000 quotations in his works from about 250 different authors. It is therefore one of the largest works of this kind which has been transmitted. It is a treasure for us, but it represents also a challenge to process all this information they contain. Second, and this is again a point of interest, Aelian gives his opinion about the information he transmits. His works are also an important contribution to the reception of antiquity and its literary production. His singular and highly individual reading is expressed in two ways. The opinion he gives on the sources he quotes, or any piece of knowledge he transmits. This allows us to see how an ancient mind works and how he is influenced by his own cultural values and ethical convictions. We can also see what debates were ongoing in antiquity about authors we may still read today, like the philosophers or other defenders of democratic values. Second, it is the selection he makes among this information that was available to him. It is more indirect for us to access, but still we have an individual of his time who decides about what he finds interesting or worth of being mentioned. My third point is his literary agenda. Up to now, I mentioned the benefits we can gain from Aelianus' work and why they are still of high value today. But his texts represent also a big challenge because of the aesthetic and literary choices Aelianus made for the assembling of his used collections. He's not the only one in doing so, but he claims that he willingly refrained from giving his collection a coherent order. He does neither process by topic, nor by sources, nor by geographical frame, or any other structuring principle you could think of to present a given amount of information you gathered. He claims, and keeps to it, that he willingly creates a disorder by varying the sequence of anecdote as much as he can. So the reader, and especially the modern reader, is constantly disoriented, led astray, or puzzled by the information he or she will discover next. In the De Natura Animalium, even if there is the overarching theme of the animals, the readers do not know of a 17 ancient book, which means hundreds of pages of a modern edition, what comes next and where the author wants to go. There is no thread to follow and no apparent narrative that would guide. May each time wonder if we come to the end of an anecdote or when we turn the page about what comes next. This may certainly be a form of entertainment and one answer to the question why Aelianus opted for this peculiar way of composing his works. But on the other hand, it is very difficult to assess the work and to find out what are actually the pieces of information they contain. It is also very difficult to navigate within the book. There is no way to tell whether Aelianus speaks of a given animal, let's say, or whether he quotes a given author unless you read through the whole book. There are no reading tools or paratextual elements that would help a reader or a user to find quickly and effectively whether or not Aelianus mentioned a piece of knowledge. So the question is how to use such a book. And from the point of view of the author himself, what is the benefit to have collected a huge amount of information and to claim to function as a sort of mediator between the knowledge hidden in huge libraries and his reader, if the own book ends up, by the chosen structure, to hide information in a similar way? Here again, as we will see, digital tools and a distant reading option might help to get another entry to this kind of works. Finally, and this is the last point of my slide here, these works, being the collection I described, mix many different types of information. Indeed, we find in his work at the same level as pieces of knowledge worth of being collected and selected and collected, very different contents. Sometimes there are strange stories or observation with paradoxical content about unusual and otherwise unobserved animals. Other pieces of knowledge report marvels or anecdotes about the edges of the world, and still others transmit known episodes from ancient Greece or Rome. So the question is, why using digital tool to explore such work? As I said, the texts by Aelianus present themselves as huge collection of pieces of information with no helping tool that would allow a reader to navigate through the mass of information. In modern edition, scholars try to provide some guidance to the reader for such books by, for instance, adding in the margin keywords for the content or the name of the animal that were dealt with. You see that on the left side on your slide. But the sheer number of anecdotes and the absence of any structure make this addition not very effective. There are too many of them so that these guiding tools become again long list of heterogeneous items. It is the same problem with table of content. Because of this absence of visible structure, there are no categories to be made in the table of content, which became once again a long list of heterogeneous items. With distant reading tools, it would be possible to assess this text from another point of view and to discover hidden patterns in the accumulation of knowledge. We could, for instance, see whether there is a sort of evaluation or progression in the author's interests. Does he speak more about one topic at the beginning of his work or in a specific part of the book? And if yes, does this tell us something about his working or composing methods? And finally, more importantly, does such pattern help us to know more about Aelian's sources, which means the book he used to compose his work and that are now lost? Then, with digital tools, provide also a means to highlight or detect the reference to ancient sources. In these, as I have said, Aelian's work are unique treasures that give us insight into the richness of ancient literary productions. Most of them are lost today. Moreover, he often is very precise in the way he gives the information, and I give here an example on the slide. In an anecdote about Wasp, which he takes from elsewhere, without telling his readers, it is only introduced as a reported speech. It is said, it is reported that, which is underlined in blue on the slide. Then he adds a quotation from Homer, more precisely from the second of the poems attributed to him from the Odyssey. He does it in a quite elaborate way by using two verbs, bearing witness to and saying, doubling grammatically a main verb with a participle before we have the lines of the poem reproduced. The anecdote ends with a final comment from the author himself, going back to the initial theme of the anecdote. In a digital environment, this reference can be singled out so that it would be possible to gather, to search for, or to visualize the textual sequence from a given author in Aelian's work. For Homer, an author whose work are still extant, the question is different than for a lost author. With Homer, scholars could compare the quoted segment in Aelianus with the text of the poem itself, and if there were differences, and explain them. With today lost authors, this tool would allow scholars to gather all the fragments from a given work that are quoted in Aelianus and get a better picture of all the preserved pieces and what topic they are dealing with. Then, next, this will be the last aspect of my introductory part. Digital tools, by analyzing pattern in text, can also be used more specifically on the wording of a given text. In my first point, I mentioned the possibility to find patterns in the content treated in these large collections. But this pattern could also focus on the way the text itself is composed in its grammatical and stylistic structures, or in the individual composing habits of different authors. Especially in the context of quotation and fragments, it is relevant to also have tools that allow us to verify the information an author provides about his source. In the case of a prose author who is quoting poetry, as in our previous example, which is also represented on the top of the slide here, the break within the flow of the text is obvious. The change of rhythm between prose and poetry is clear, and in this case belongs to the markers that allows an author to tell his reader that the textual sequence which follows is a piece of a text that is not his own. With prose quotation, as in the second example on the bottom of the slide, the difference is less perceptible. Nonetheless, if the author is introducing a foreign piece of writing into his own text, the difference in rhythm should also be seen or measured. Or to state it differently, if the difference between the two textual sequences, the author's own utterance and the foreign piece of text, is not present, this might be a sign that the quoting author is intervening into the text and adapted to his own wording. This is also a way of judging how close a transmitted quotation may be to the original wording of the first author who composed this textual sequence, and gives us precious hints about the working practices of the quoting author. And with this last point, I end my presentation, and I'm happy to hand over to my colleagues who will illustrate the digital tools that could answer to all the questions I have raised.
Okay, Alexandra, thank you. I think that now we can pass, unless there are questions, we can pass to the second, we can move to the second part concerning computational text analysis.
So just briefly, we were going to have a very quick response to Alexandra's last point. And I think it might be interesting maybe for those of us who come from a more digital humanities background and know Aelian less well, to maybe think a little bit about a couple of the points that Alexandra made in the last couple of slides. I had one question in particular, which is, so I'm glad that you mentioned that that Aelian explicitly and deliberately does not have an internal structure to the work, to the De Natura Animalium, because one of the things that I was looking for was with the very simple visualizations that I'll show in a few minutes, was whether I could detect a structure in there without having read it, and then show it to you and see whether you agreed with my structure. So maybe as a sort of self-defense before I do that, I might ask you, and maybe you and Lucia might both have an opinion about, so Aelian deliberately says there is no internal structure to this work. Do you agree that there's no internal structure, or do you have a sense that there maybe is a structure that he may have not known about, or he may have just been concealing? Do you find any kind of patterns and progression in his work? Either of you?
I'm not sure if I'm the first person to answer, because Lucia nodded a lot, so she may have a lot to say. Indeed, he says that he decided not to follow the traditional order, so there's a willingness to use variety and to construct it. So also to really have a mindset that tells him, if I fall into a pattern, I have to cut it and to make it in the biggest variety possible. But still, the question remains, can we go behind his willingness and to find still kind of associating a kind of mindset which he didn't is aware himself of? So that would be my answer, and I'm happy to give the word to Lucia.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think there's no structure at all, because he does not want to have any structure, because he says otherwise it would be boring, just boring for people. I don't want to bore the reader. So in fact, it's this kind of work, it's very easy reading, because you can open the book anytime and close it anytime. You don't have to follow any history. So it's something like those short stories for children when they go to bed. You can open it anywhere, you can close it whenever you want, and it's always entertaining. And that's his point. He explains it very clearly at the beginning. So there's no structure. The structure is short chapters of different length. There are very short ones, very long ones. So and he tries not to put together two that have that treat the same subject. So he tries to always to put them, if they treat the same animal, he tries to put them in different parts of the work. In fact, there's one of the manuscripts where someone has reordered the whole work. So if the first chapter deals with bees, for instance, that copyist has been looking around the whole book, trying to find the chapters about bees, and so he put all together. And then second, elephants. So and he has done the same. So he has rewritten the whole book, ordering then according to the animals. But that's not what Aelian wanted to do.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, just a point about that. If it's more than an identity, I mean, an aesthetic choice, then it becomes interesting also as a point of access to textual genetics in a way. I mean, you get interested in the way he distributed his material depending on the sources, more than just on what he intended to do as a work, really. So you still can reveal things, but it's more about history. And it made me think of Aldous Gelius, for example. And authors like that pretend not to have order. So you can't see order, but it doesn't mean exactly what you usually try to look for in these works.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I think we'll come back to that point maybe after my quick visualization, and we can see whether I seem to have found anything, or whether my failure to find anything is just a confirmation of what you already knew. Did anybody else want to bring up anything else? Monica, do you want to bring anything else up before I?
No, I think I will add something after your visualization, just to say maybe that we are influenced by our vision because we live in a printed age, and definitely want to find also a structure for our work. But the interesting thing will be, I don't want to spoil, but the interesting thing is that with digital tools, we can show how ancient authors were working. In this case, Aelian said, no, I don't want a structure, but we find these things also for other works. This is interesting because they were working in a different way. They were living in a more dynamic way. And the interesting thing is that with digital tools, now we can rediscover these elements, something that we have also today with digital data, where we have this open text, which is a problem because then we generate never-ending text. But I think this is fascinating. So I think we can go back to these things later after your visualization.
Great. Cool, good, thank you. Then I'll very quickly then I'll go to my part of the presentation, and I can no longer see you. So can you see my screen now, my slide now?
Yes, now we can see the slides, Gabby. Yes.
Great. So just a note that I'm going to give a very brief summary of what text analysis broadly is and does, and some of the issues around it. This is going to be very brief, firstly, and secondly, it comes with an apology to anyone who either knows about text analysis, for whom this will be a very naive and inadequate summary, and also for anyone who's a philologist who may also find this a bit of a shallow summary. My aim is really to introduce what we mean by text analysis to someone who is neither, right? So to a very general audience, just to get us all on the same page, which is why I'm going to just try and be very, very brief. So I basically want to ask three questions. So what is computational text analysis? When we're talking about text analysis, oh, for goodness sake, we normally mean using computers to help us study text, either at large scale or using statistical methods, or what are sometimes called distant methods, and I'll talk a bit more about that slightly inadequate terminology in a moment. So where rather than reading a text as a human reader from beginning to end, or even just dipping in and out, we use computers to look for patterns, to look for information about word usage, and potentially information about style that may come out, not through reading it in a traditional way, but through numerical analysis of features of the text. And so one thing that can be used to study a text, to look closely at a text, as I'll show with my examples in a moment, is looking at very common words. So words like particles and conjunctions and articles and so forth, things that we normally ignore when we're reading, even in other languages, but especially in our own, but that actually the usage of and the frequencies of and so forth can sometimes tell us things about individual authors, can help us identify individual authors. Another feature which can sometimes be quite interesting to look at in this sort of computational analysis is relative frequencies. So as opposed to simply absolute frequencies, what is the most common word in this text? The most common word is probably kai, right, which is the Greek word for and. It's the most common word in almost any text in Greek. That doesn't tell us anything at all. But what is the most common word relative to how common that word is in the corpus as a whole? That then becomes quite interesting. Which words are more common in this text than they are across the Greek language? So looking at relative frequencies in that sense. And the other thing that people sometimes use text analysis to look at is to look at changes across the text. So are there points in the text where the style changes, where grammatical changes happen, where other aspects of the language itself evolve over the course of a text? Features like the richness of vocabulary, how much originality is there, how many hapax words used only once as opposed to repetition of words, which can both be to do with the absolute number of words used in a text, but also to do with the relative frequency and rarity of those individual words. We can look at things like sentence lengths, average sentence lengths, or distribution of sentence lengths, which is again not a very interesting thing to notice when you or I are reading a novel, but it can, in a sense, tell us something sometimes about authors or about other features of the text. And finally, the other thing that text analysis can help us to pull out is what we call collocates or engrams, which are two different ways of looking at words that frequently appear together. So collocates are words that appear anywhere near one another, and engrams are patterns of words of 2, 3, or more words that always appear as a phrase. And seeing those sorts of patterns can again tell us things about the text or the author or the identity of the text that we wouldn't necessarily get by reading the text in the normal linear way as a human. So those are some of the things that we do with text analysis. Why would we be interested as literary scholars or linguistic scholars in this sort of computational text analysis? Well, one thing that's often discussed is this concept of distant reading, which I'm not sure I like that terminology very much, because unfortunately a lot of people get the sense that when we say distant reading, it means you can read across this large corpus of text without actually reading every word, and therefore people get a bit defensive, and they come up with these slightly tortured ways of getting around it, like calling it scalable reading or things like that, which I think is kind of unnecessary and a bit strawmanny. But in a sense, so what these sort of analyses enable us to do is get an overview of a text or a series or a corpus by looking at the sorts of patterns we've just been talking about across these texts. So looking at what are the most frequent, what are the words with the highest relative frequencies across this text? Can that tell us anything about the narrative there, about the plot, about the characters that are important in this text, about other features in there? What sorts of verbs are used? How much is this text mostly about action, or a lot about introspection, or a lot about dialogue? These sorts of frequencies can help us with that, either by looking across an individual text or looking at the quality of a corpus as a whole. People use these to study stylistics, to think about author attribution from texts that we don't necessarily know the author, whose author is disputed, and also forensic reasons for looking at this. You can help us to identify fakes, forgeries, or misattributed texts from antiquity. And one of the most important things that people use text analysis for is, and this is again one of the reasons why I think distant reading is a slight misnomer, is that it helps us to identify, or not a misnomer, but it doesn't have the problems that people who are concerned about it as a misnomer really think it has, is that it's most often it's used for identifying oddities in the text that you then look at more closely. So if you find a pattern in the text that you really weren't expecting and is counterintuitive, then you go back and read the text more closely and get a sense, so it helps you to ask more questions rather than claiming to give you answers as I was going to say. So how do we do computational text analysis? Well, there's a combination of things. A lot of people will use a lot of standard tools. We can use the Voyant toolkit, which I'll be showing in a second. There's tools like AntConc and many others, or even just the Google Brook Ngram search, which gives you, a distributional visualization of how frequent a particular word was across the corpus of Google Books over the last couple of centuries. Very, very simple tools, down to programming your own analysis using tools like Python or R, both of which have libraries for text analysis, or network analysis tools, and so forth. So depending on how much control you want over the questions you're asking, you might choose one or other of these methods. And then there's the problem of how you communicate the results of this. One sort of answer to this is that the visualization of your text analysis may in fact be a better way to communicate your research than it is necessarily the research itself. It's both, of course, but it may be a really valuable way to communicate the research once you've decided what visualization you think is useful. But by the same token, given that you could have many visualizations as you go in tweaking various parameters, and you've ended up picking the one you like, it can therefore be misleading if you omit other visualizations. And so, like any visualization or abstraction of a text or of a set of research results, it's also prone to being misleading. You can either lie, or you can be mistaken, or various other misleading features can creep in to these visualizations. So it's important to be transparent about what has gone into your production of these visualizations. And there is this question of whether, as I mentioned in the last slide, whether text analysis is a way simply to suggest new avenues of research, to look for oddities and then look at them more closely, or is it a way to prove anything? I've very often looked at these sorts of things and thought, that's really interesting. How can I look at that more closely and explain it? But I'm always a little bit dubious when people say, well, this text analysis has proved that I'm not saying you can never use it as evidence for something, but it's maybe a little bit more sort of woolly than that. So just a quick note before we go to the visualization. Monica's put together this useful slide with some links to some sources of the text of Aelianus, in particular the De Natura Animalium. So in the Perseus catalog, and also in the GitHub repository of the Perseus digital library, and we've also added at the end of there the Dionysius Ancient Greek corpus, which is the source of the lemmatized version of the NA that I'll be showing in a few minutes. And was there anything else about this this slide that you wanted to mention, Monica, before we move on?
You have, in any case, you have the links. You can access the links through the slides, but you find the links also in GitHub. And the interesting thing is that in the Perseus catalog, you can find metadata about Claudius Aelianus, so information about him, but also digital metadata, and many links to open editions, to different critical editions available today in a digital format and as open access. And then you can access through the Perseus catalog and then through the Perseus DL GitHub repository the XML file of the Teubner edition, because it's now free of copyright, so it's accessible, and you have the Greek text, so if you want to work with it. And then through the Orisis, of course, which is another corpus, you have also annotations, which means part of speech, and the lemmatization for the Greek text. But as for now, I think, and of course, you find in this slide in green, you have links in the sense that you can access web pages, but those links is interesting, especially the first ones, because you have those URNs. We don't have the time to talk about them, but anyway, they are identifiers. So they are unique identifiers for identifying the author, the work, and possibly also the edition, and then going down to the text, both in the Greek original form, but also possibly in translations. But I stop here because this is a big problem. But anyway, so this is what I wanted to add.
Great, thanks. Yeah. So just the last point, that the final link there to the Diaeresis corpus, that gets you the entire corpus. You can't just download Aelian from that, but you'd get the entire corpus, of which there is a folder for Aelian in the middle of. So just a note there. So yes, I've linked here on this slide, which I will take off the screen in a second. But this is also linked in the Sunoikisis page for this session. And if you found this this session randomly on YouTube rather than through Sunoikisis, there's a link to that session page below the video on YouTube. And so these links are on there. But there's also a link to the text files that we've used in these two visualizations, if you wanted to download those text files and try them out yourself, either in Voyant or in some other interface. So just very quickly then, the two visualizations that I wanted to show, and I'm just going to show a couple of simple things just to illustrate two main points, and then I will make a fairly naive suggestion about what I think the structure of this text is, not having read it, and before Alexandra and Lucia told me that there was no structure to the text. But I will just show these two visualizations very quickly. So the first point I want to make is that over here on the left, I've just loaded up, for this case, I've loaded up the 17 books of Aelian as a separate text file for each one. And so when looking across the corpus as a whole, it has, if you see over here on the right, it has the, it'll show you which book each of these features appears in. So the first thing I'm putting out is that this is just as it comes out of the box, not using any stop words options or anything like that, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. And so this word cloud here of the absolute frequencies of words in this text is, as I suggested earlier, chi is the most frequent word, as it is in almost every Greek text or corpus, and that's really not particularly helpful information. It might be if you're really interested in looking at the relative frequencies of some of those most common words, but that is not a really useful word cloud. Otherwise, the second thing I wanted to show is that I then, in a second visualization, I put all of the text of Aelian's NA into a single text file, but taken from the Diaeresis corpus, I included only the lemmata in there, which is to say the dictionary head words rather than the individual words. This is relevant because ancient Greek is an inflected language, and so some words, like for example the word for chi doesn't inflect, so that'll only appear once. But the word for the definite article, has some dozen or so different forms that might appear, which is many of which you see on here. So this second visualization here has the lemmatized forms instead. And so here you see a slightly different set of words. Chi is still the most frequent, but you also see ho, which is that is the word for that is the definite article in its lemmatized form. So we're no longer getting all of the different forms individually, and just seeing a couple of words that we didn't see in the unlemmatized version here, or at least not among the largest words. We're getting words like Amy, which is the verb to be. We're seeing autos, a couple of other words in there that once you lemmatize, these words become more frequent, more visibly frequent than the individual forms of the unlemmatized form. However, that word frequency list is still not particularly interesting because it's probably not particularly different from any other Greek corpus. The other thing to note, and this is equally true of both lemmatized and unlemmatized, is that on this trends visualization, which is another quite nice visualization that Voyant will do for you out of the box. I mean, I haven't done anything to this. I've just opened Voyant, loaded these texts in so far. It'll show you the relative frequencies of the 5 most common words in the corpus across the corpus, so in each book. And you can see these 5 most common words, so there are 2 different words for and 3 different forms of the definite articles, so not particularly interesting words from this point of view. Basically, they're static across the corpus. And is always the most frequent word. The second word for and is also always fairly frequent, and the 3 versions of the are, you know, pretty close to one another. So this doesn't tell us anything very, very interesting. I couldn't claim to make any claims about the corpus by seeing that the word for and is most frequent in book 2 and least frequent in book 15, because it's still the most frequent word in both of those books. It doesn't really make any difference whatsoever. So what I'm going to do is, and this I believe is only possible thanks to Aelian, who's in the presentation with us, is I'm going to tell Voyant that this text is in ancient Greek, because it somehow hasn't identified that automatically, and I'm simply going to say use the ancient Greek stopwords list. And so this means it's no longer it's going to omit from those frequency lists the most common words, and particularly those function words, which are very small, like and the, and you know, in and of, and words like that don't mean anything. But the most common, the words that are now appearing as most common in this list are mostly, you know, verbs, nouns, and adjectives. So they're content words rather than function words. So we're now seeing something which maybe, if I didn't know anything about the text, tells me a little bit more. So we've got onoma, we've got hudor, we've got zoon, so words to do with naming, to do with life. We've got words for humans. We've got words for animals. We've got words for fish. Things like this turning up. So maybe this book has something to do with different kinds of animals and different kinds of living things. I mean, you know, it's called the Natura, Animalium, or the nature of animals, so maybe that's, I knew that already, but it's, you know, that's already telling us a little bit something. And if I reset this list over here, we also start to see the relative frequencies of the words, of function words within this do vary quite a bit more. I mean, it's still a bit of a mess, but, and, you know, zoon and zoon appear side by side, and they're just the accusative singular and genitive plural of the same word. So that's maybe not very very helpful. But that's slightly more promising if we were looking for patterns across the text to see something like that. And if I use the lemmatized version over here, and I look again, I ask it to use the ancient Greek stopword list. We see again a slightly different list here, but we'll come to that. And in the trends, we start to see some maybe slightly more interesting trends. But actually, I'm going to select some potentially slightly more interesting words. How do I make sure that this list of most common words down here includes the stopwords? I may just need to refresh this. No, it's turned off my stopwords. Apologies. Just take a second to do this. I may need to select stopwords from over here as well, maybe I. No, that's already. Okay, so this list of most common words is still including stopwords. Okay, but if I look for words in this list, let me see if I can quite quickly come up with some. I remember that. Eliphas was a fairly common word, so we can already start to see in which books elephants are mentioned more often. Now, if he's really distributing everything completely randomly, why are there so many elephants around the middle of the text? This isn't book 5. This is probably around book 8 or 9 or so. And why are there almost no elephants at all in books 15 and 16? I mean, is that interesting? Maybe not. If I look for the word for dog, we see that in that one book where he mentions elephants a lot, he also mentions dogs, not nearly as much, but more than anywhere else. And he does, you know, so his distribution of elephant and dog are actually quite similar. Let's look at his distribution of fish in the same text. So he does mention fish a lot in that section of the book where he doesn't mention elephants at all and doesn't mention dogs very much. This is maybe not very interesting, but it is starting to be the sort of thing that you could claim that he's making a pattern in here. Does he mention the sea in the same books that he mentions fish? Yes, I think that the frequencies of fish and sea are fairly similar. That's maybe not surprising. But anyway, I don't want to go on much longer on this, but that's the sort of thing that I would then turn back to Alexandra and Lucia and say, is there some promise in looking maybe in a bit more detail at this sort of frequency and seeing if we're actually starting to find patterns in the text that involuntarily Aelian was structuring in some way, that his attempt to randomize and keep interesting maybe failed at this level, and we're actually seeing some interesting sort of pattern. So the book in which fish was mentioned most is the book in which elephants are mentioned almost not at all. That's maybe non-random. That's a little bit too specific. But I'll stop there, and we can maybe, I don't know, maybe Alexandra or Lucia wants to respond to that briefly before we move on.
I maybe just have a few ideas, a few comments. One thing I was very interested when you maybe keep these presentations. On the first one, not this one, the other one, you had the animals, but of course, the two words for me, animals, are quite among the more frequent, but we have also ictus, the name of the fishes, and when you read through the book, you have more the idea that other animals are important for Aelianus. He has very good opinion about elephants, and you think that elephants are in the center of what he's saying, but actually in this analyzing tool, it's the fish which appears more. So there's something to compare or to add to this. The two readings, the two approach can add something. And another point is on the same slide. The verb aku, I hear. If we are speaking later about quotation and using text from other authors, the fact that the word I have heard is so much more present than, let's say, he says or he reports or it's also something which puzzles me from your analysis. Yeah. And I'm keeping it here for the moment.
Yeah, one nice thing that I noticed is actually in the lemmatized version, Quo is not among the most common words. It may be on this list somewhere lower down, smaller, but it's not very. Oh yeah, there it is down there. It's not one of the 10 most common words, but it's there in the list. But in the unlemmatized, it's one of the 2 or 3 most common words in the whole text, and that tells us. Or that tells me, without having read the text, that when he uses that verb, he almost always uses it in the first person singular active indicative, right? Present active indicative. So he is literally saying, I hear that. He doesn't talk about other things hearing or things in the past or the future hearing. He's specifically saying, I hear. And so it's the exact word that he uses, which makes it really frequent in the unlemmatized version. So yeah, that's a really interesting sort of observation. Yeah, thank you. I see there's a couple of questions on the chat. Do you want us to address them now, or do you want to come back to those later, Monica?
Maybe this one, because the first question was already answered, a question by Anise, and there is this note from Anise, our colleague and friend from Brazil.
So, so this is this thing down here on the bottom left of the screen where they talk about words per sentence. So in the lemmatized version, I rather unwisely I had to process the lemmatized text to keep just the lemmater, and I decided to delete all the punctuation, which seemed to me a harmless thing to do, but it had the unfortunate effect of making the entire text appear to be one sentence. So that was just silly of me. But even for this one, it says, you know, the highest the average words per sentence in book 14 is 1,080 words. That's just got to be a problem with the punctuation in the text, right, in the file. Maybe some words that we use that are used as punctuation in ancient Greek are not considered punctuation by Voyant's calculation there, or maybe the punctuation is just missing in some places. I don't know, but it's got to just be a function of that. I mean, it's also maybe sentence length in an ancient Greek text is a slightly awkward thing to ask about, given that you know, punctuation is so often modern and editorial, and even if it isn't, you know, what we normally mean by a sentence and what an ancient Greek would have meant by a sentence may be slightly different things. So I think that's. I mean, I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that, or anyhow, or someone else.
Well, punctuation is problematic in the sense that, of course, we have punctuation in modern editions. We still use punctuation for computational purposes, for example, for sentence splitting. This is very important. We can also annotate punctuation, because definitely is a form of interpretation also on the part of modern editors. And this is the reason why we have different forms of punctuation in different editions. Sometimes, of course, we may need to remove punctuation for other computational purposes, as in this case, because we want to remove it and to focus on other elements like words, lemmatas, and occurrences of words in an entire work or in an entire corpus. Of course, we have different possibilities. And this is something very important. So when you work with the data and you want to work also with the Voyant tools, and for example, for Aelianus, we have, you can access the text of Aelianus in a digital form in an XML format, for example, which is a specific markup language. Then you have to choose what you want to do, if you want to preserve the XML, and then beyond that, if you need to work a bit on the Greek text you have, which is in any case always depending on a modern edition. So you have to consider the decisions and the interpretations of a specific editor, so which is another layer above the Greek text. Not to speak of many other elements, but I think I can stop here about this. I don't know if there are other comments in
yes, and just practically, yes. I mean, semicolons and middle dots are quite a problem when the software is standardized and oriented toward multilingual, well, to become a multilingual environment, not going very deep into the specificities of the languages, but permitting a wide variety of analysis with different languages. So it's pretty random sometimes.
Yes, when you work with historical languages, but not only, also with, you can have problems also with modern and contemporary languages. Remember to consider character encoding, so how the punctuation is represented, because this can be problematic. Maybe you visualize the punctuation in a correct form, but the encoding behind is correct, or we can have different codes. So this is a well-known problem. This is about, in general, character encoding. And then for historical languages, this is the problem. For example, for ancient Greek, there are punctuation elements that can be understood from the machine, but others like the middle dot, which are a bit problematic, especially for sentence splitting. So
you probably could go a bit deeper and do something more precise if you use the server version of Voyant locally, but then at some point you're just tweaking someone else's code, and why won't you do that then? I mean, with full control with your own code and going to a different set of tools.
Yes, I think this is an important point. So in general, not only for these texts, not only for ancient Greek, but when you work with these tools, consider your data. So definitely there is always a work of not cleaning data. You can't have a perfect data, which is what we want to have, but this is impossible. But anyway, you have to consider many different levels in a digital environment. In order then to get proper results, not perfect results, but at least reasonable results. And then maybe you have to go back, because a tool like Voyant tools can reveal problems also about the encoding and other things, including punctuation, of course.
One thing that I forgot to mention about text analysis is the very common observation that when you're doing any kind of text analysis, you probably spend somewhere between half and 3/4 of your research time cleaning the text before you run it through any tools. Because you really do have to, do you want to lemmatized text? Do you want to keep encoding in there? Do you want to keep brackets and numbers in there? Do you want to, all sorts of things that you might need to clean up? So that's another issue that's worth just sort of mentioning. Monica, you should probably press on and talk a bit to us about reuse detection, because I'm afraid Alexandra and I haven't left you very much time.
One second. So okay, so I can briefly talk about text reuse. So give me 1 second. So okay, here it is, and I'm slide showing. So you should be able to see my slides.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we wanted to mention also briefly reuse detection, because as Alexandra mentioned at the beginning of this session, Aelianus is a very interesting author because he preserves information about other authors and other works. And of course, he cites authors and works in very different ways. And this is something that we can today define as text reuse. In classics, we use another expression. We talk about fragments, which are basically not material fragments, but references to other authors and works. And the term fragment is used to refer to the final result of a work of interpretation, where we try to reconstruct the original quoted text. Because an interesting thing is that in many cases we have citations of lost authors. Anyway, in this slide I have summarized a few things about recent work on text reuse for modern and contemporary languages, and there is an effort today in the community to try to use these digital methods also for historical languages, with many complexities, of course. One of them is not only because we are dealing with ancient dead languages, but also because most of the text reuse that we are trying to detect is lost, basically. And I have here in this slide just a reference to the case of ancient Greek historiography, a specific genre within a specific ancient language, where basically what we have is really not much. But in any case, in our extant sources, we still have many traces, and through these traces we can try to reconstruct lost authors and works. And here I have 3 examples from the text of Aelianus, simple examples in this. Well, they are not simple because there are many complexities, but I will start with the first example already mentioned by Alexandra at the beginning, where we have Aelianus citing a still extant author, the epic poet Homer. Okay, and in this case we still have the text of Homer. And I am not going to mention the complexities of the Homeric corpus, but in any case, we have a version, let's say, of the Odyssey, like in this case of Homer, and basically we can align, we can compare the text of Aelianus with the version of the Odyssey of Homer that we have today. And here I'm again showing the slide with the Greek and the English translation of Aelianus, where he's citing a verse of Homer. In this case, we have a verbatim quotation, and we can try today to detect these forms of quotation. I have here an example where we can align basically the verse of the Odyssey, which is cited by Aelianus, with the chapter in book 5 of the work of Aelianus, where we have this verse. Of course, this is a very simple example because we are aligning the precise verse, we already know that, and the text. And in this case, I'm showing a text reuse detection tool based on the Smith-Waterman algorithm, which is an algorithm used for also for text reuse detection, but not only, because this is an algorithm that performs low consequence alignments. And I stop here because we need another session for describing this. But in any case, in this case, we see that the algorithm can identify the verse, not with 100% precision. Why? Because, of course, we are aligning two different text with the different extension. So this is the reason. But in any case, we have the identification of the verse. If we align something longer, like for example a few verses of the Odyssey, including the verse which is cited by Aelianus, of course the situation is a bit different, because the algorithm can identify an extended portion of the text, and we have a different score, of course, because the machine doesn't know anything about Homer, anything about Aelianus. The machine doesn't know Greek, but there is an effort, okay, to align those texts and to identify, let's say, similarities. And again, we don't have the time to deepen this aspect, but when working with text reuse, very interesting things come up. For example, in this case where we have, okay, the yellow part is the part where we have the verse of Homer, but we have the black and the gray color, because the machine can identify also hidden problems, like, for example, OCR errors, differences in punctuation, or other character encoding problems. Even if the Greek is correct, there are other hidden elements which are revealed by the algorithm. And this is something, again, speaking of cleaning data and working with the code behind. Then I have a second example, which is very interesting for us classicists, where we have the citation of a lost author. In this case, we have another passage from book 11 of the work of Aelianus, where Aelianus is citing Hekateus of Abdera. And in this case, the original text of Hekateus is lost. We have only the citation of Aelianus. Of course, in this case, technically, we don't have text reuse in the sense of modern text reuse, because we can't align two texts, but we can try to identify in this passage elements that possibly belong to the original text of Hekateus. And something like this, so this passage of Hekateus in traditional classics is collected in external editions. For example, this passage is considered fragment 4 in an external edition. This is an edition of the ancient Greek fragmentary authors, where we can see that this passage of Aelianus is collected and considered fragment 4 of this lost author. Today we have a digital version of this collection, where we have both the Greek text and the Latin. And with the text and okay, we have also the catalog. But what we can do is, for example, to align the Greek, the text of the edition of Aelianus with an external edition of fragmentary text. Basically, what we have here, in this case, we have an alignment between the edition, a specific edition of Aelianus, and another edition, which is a collection of the fragments of the author preserved in Aelianus. And in this case, as you can see, we have, this is, the text of Aelianus, the Natura Animalium, and above we have the same text as it is reproduced in a collection of fragments about Hecataeus. Of course, the text is almost the same, even if there are differences, and in fact the algorithm sees that the text is almost the same, but with differences, and in fact we have a score of 70% because we can have differences between two editions in terms of punctuation, not to speak of other computational issues like OCR errors or character encoding. I mean, different ways for encoding the same Greek letters or diacritics. And what we are doing here is also to align two different XML versions of the text. So basically we have the text extracted in the collection of fragments, and we try to identify this in an external file, which is the XML file of the work of Aelianus in the Perseus Digital Library. And then you can also export an XML file where an attribute is added to signal that in this passage of Aelianus we have a text reuse. Then I will, of course, as you can see with Lost, I can't mention other methodologies, but for representing citations and reuses of lost authors, we can also use other methods, not only the alignment between the edition of the extant author and another edition with the fragmentary text, but we can also use, for example, linguistic annotations to visualize changes in the syntax of a text where we have a citation. And again, this is a kind of research which is really new. We are still at the beginning. We don't have today results, but we are producing that, especially linguistic annotations, for trying to represent linguistic and syntactic features in the text to signal the presence of a citation, to see if the syntax changes, and probably the author is using an extended portion of the original text. And then finally, to conclude, another example, or at least another way for working with reuses, is another example with the citation of a lost author. In this case, we have Aelianus in book 2 citing an almost unknown author, Leonidas of Byzantium. And in this case, again, we have the same problem. We don't have the original text of Leonidas, but the interesting thing is that today the focus is to work on the language of the citation, not just only on the fragment, so on the content of the reuse, the topic, but on the language for introducing the fragment. So the name of the ancient author, other information like the place where he came from or he was intellectually active, and then maybe also the content of the work, his interest, like in this case where we have a reference to the interest of Leonidas for fishes. And okay, in this case I have an entry in Wikidata because we don't have this author in the Perseus catalog, also because basically we have citations of this author in Aelianus and also in Athenaeus, but we still miss more data in the Perseus catalog and in other related resources. We have this author also in, this author is mentioned in another author, Athenaeus of Naucratis, who is similar to Aelianus because he's a rich source of citations of lost authors. And in this slide, I'm visualizing a concordance of the text of the Deipnos office where we can see the name of this author in a specific passage with other name entities. But now I can skip this slide. In any case, you have the link if you want to work, if there are people also on YouTube and following us interested specifically in these kind of works, you have the links and you can play a bit with these resources. I would like to conclude with this slide. I understand that this is ancient Greek for those of you not reading ancient Greek. In any case, this is an example of what we can do today. So the effort is to annotate the language of the reuse. Before, when Gabriel was showing Voyant tools, and Alexandra also was commenting on the language. The language is, of course, about the content. For example, we can visualize where dogs, fishes, elephants are mentioned in Aelianus, but we have other elements, like, for example, verbs introducing a fragment or reuse. Leonidas says that, he reports that, or, like as in the case of Aelianus, I heard that. All these elements today can be annotated. There are tools where we can annotate all these elements and then extract them for further computational purposes and also philological purposes. In this slide, I'm showing an example of a Greek passage where we have the annotation of specific elements about text reuses. In this case, the focus is on annotating names of ancient authors who are cited or used by other authors, and possibly titles of works. And in this case, we can see the Greek form of this author, Leonidas of Byzantium, and we can add other layers of annotation. We can identify the two terms, Leonidas and Byzantius, the proper name and the adjective referring to the place where this author was coming from, and then we can add further layers of annotation, like the name, and then also a Wikidata, the Wikidata entry, where we can get more metadata, and then we can also add more data. And in a resource like this, which is an annotation environment, of course, we can add other annotations, also linguistic annotations, like verba dicendi or other expressions that we have in the text. So in this case, the perspective is a bit different, because we are not only focusing on the reusing itself, but also on the language of the reuse, which is quite complex and interesting, and then in the future we will be able to extract more data. But I think I can stop here, also because we have less than 10 minutes for possible questions. And I think, I can come back to our StreamYard room.
Great, yeah, thanks a lot, Monica. There's, again, this may be a moment to invite Lucia and Alexandra to react to any of the examples or any of the methods that Monica's just talked about, and also invite questions from anybody watching live on YouTube. We're keeping an eye on the chat if you want to post anything.
Okay, shall I start? Just a comment to the last slide about which actually answers to my last slide about how not only contents, like the variation, the use of fishes or other, but also the stylistic and the grammatical and the patterns of verbs that may single out or mark quotations, and that we can annotate them. Seems for me really another interesting point of how we can enhance this text, that it would be easier to see what is in this text, rather than just going through them individually and make lists or concordances of what we have found. So as a first comment.
Yes, definitely. This is the distant reading element that Gabriel was mentioning before. So the idea not to read the text as a sequence, that we always need to read the text sequentially, but we can also have a distant reading focusing on different elements, including the syntax. Today, we are still the beginning, but to use linguistic annotations, for example, for visualizing through trees the syntax of these texts to see if there are really changes in the syntax, and definitely we have them because Aelianus and other authors were citing other texts, and in some way, of course, we can identify these elements. So this is a possible way for visualizing text reuses, and then definitely we can generate other views for see how many authors are cited and where. I have some experience with the Deipnosophists, and I have read the entire text of Athenaeus, and definitely you can see, again, the structure is quite complex. In the end, we don't have, well, this is a complex problem, but anyway, so the structure, let's say that the structure is quite complex, and definitely Athenaeus was using intermediate sources. He was not reading everything. But this is another problem. But definitely with these tools, we can have different views. And this is the reason why at the beginning I mentioned the fact that sometimes we can go back to the way ancient authors were collecting all these materials, putting these materials together. And this was not just a moment, as writing a book in a moment, let's say in a few years, but collecting a lot of materials for their entire life. And then, of course, we have to consider the role of following editors. And also then I mentioned the fact that late editors tried to give a structure to the text, not to speak of these problems, of course.
Okay.
I hope that also for our audience, this part, which is a bit, let's say, technical, both from a philological and a computational point of view, is anyway. I hope that this part was clear. In any case, this is the interesting thing. So with Aelianus, we have a very interesting example of an author reusing other authors, preserving information about a huge amount of lost authors. And this is really a dig in the text, okay? Dig in the text. We want to, and this is the eternal effort of editors. Today, again, we have the same questions. We are using different tools for exploring these texts. So this is the idea. But of course, we are still in an experimental phase, definitely, for various reasons, because we still miss data and we need to add more annotations. Aurélien, probably you want
just
to say.
Out of curiosity, I mean, the types of analysis that could be interesting that the computer can do and we can't is when things are not seen by us intuitively as semantic. Like, what if the animals in the end are used more or less in alphabetical order because that's how he was using his sources or things like that, or the material aspects of dealing with papyri, for example, and the length of books. So these kind of things that we
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear your last bit because my computer was doing something wrong. Could you please repeat your last question?
Yes, I was just wondering whether for these kind of text we could have data that were not accessible before, like what can we do with the topics or the names of the animals here when we look at the actual first letter in a list, which is the kind of information that he had when he was composing the work, for example. It can tell us about the sources, that, or the length of the books, or the parts of the books in relation to papyri and the material constraints.
I don't think he worked with that kind of things in mind, I'm sorry to say, because I have been comparing, for instance, Aelian with Athenaeus, because sometimes Aelian uses Athenaeus, even though he never mentions him. And sometimes he uses Athenaeus in the same order. I mean, not everything in Athenaeus, 3 or 4 things, but following the same order as they appear in. Why? Because they are disordered. I mean, in Athenaeus, they have an order, a logical order, according to Athenaeus' purpose. So he picks this, and this, which are disordered if you take them out of context. So it has nothing to do with, I think you can, I don't think, I mean, in another author, that may be an issue, but in this case, I don't think this will work. That will not tell us anything about really how he worked. And also another problem I see with the frequency of the frequencies of the names of the animals. It may depend on the length of the chapter. I mean, if you have 2 big chapters on elephants, then one little one on dogs, and on. I mean, if the bigger the chapter is, the more frequent the animal will be mentioned. So that kind of misleading. You have to take into account the length of the chapter, because that, I mean, it can be just a coincidence because the chapter is very, very long.
So that's catered for a bit by relative frequencies, right? Because it's saying how frequent is it in this chapter compared to how frequent you would expect it to be across the corpus as a whole. So I think that's partly, maybe not entirely, but I think that is partly catered for by that.
May I add, if we speak about length, another question I was wondering, when using or trying to use a voyant to find patterns, how much chunks of text do you need to have an answer, to have something significant? I mean, you told us the whole book or the whole work, but if you speak about quotations and how stylistic changes, it would be quite interesting to only analyze one anecdote and see if there are changes. How much text is it significant to have an anecdote with 4 lines? Would it still be usable in this voyant tool, or how much do you need to have an answer, to have something which is relevant? So maybe to both of you, to Gabriel, to Aurelia.
Aelian will have a much more sophisticated answer than me, but my instinct is to say 4 lines would be too little, because you wouldn't get much out of it that you wouldn't see yourself from looking at those 4 lines. It spots patterns that we can't spot. That's where it's valuable. So I'd say at least a page or 2 of text for it to start to give you meaningful answers. But Aelian may have more sophisticated response than that.
Of course, there are no hard rules. If it makes you think, then it's interesting. And you can think of I mean, when you read 4 lines, or you can have new ideas watching the whole corpus being transformed into something different. So, and then patterns are, I mean, really need more sophisticated algorithms to appear, or annotated data. And in this case, we're trying to avoid both. So it's not really the tool we want for that.
Yes, exactly. Your research question is important. As I was showing also before, we can align one verse of Homer. Okay, we already know that, but that's the thing. That's the thing. In many cases, well, we don't know the answers, but we look for things that we already know. This is another problematic thing. But of course, we can do that. The ideal world is to align big corpora. And And I have here, for example, another questions in the chat. So how much of fragments can be now marked automatically? If it is about fragments of known, still extant authors, technically with the alignment, we can detect all of them. With lost authors, nothing still. In the sense, because we, or at least we can do partially, but we have to work on the language. Names of authors cited. Ekatheus says that when we don't have the name of the author, which happens in ancient sources, because they, for example, Lucia was mentioning the fact that Aelianus was using Athenaeus, maybe not citing Athenaeus, but he was using Athenaeus. That's the problem. And we also have generic expressions. In that case, we can't really still identify these fragments, and we can work on the language, so not on the fragment in itself, or at least from a computational point of view. Here we are really at the beginning.
I think Aurélien is absolutely right to maybe correct my my initial naive answer to Alexandra's question that if it makes you think, then it's enough, as you say, because again, as I said, what we're usually doing is looking for oddities that make us think rather than trying to prove anything, right? So we don't have a solution. We're not looking for an answer. We're looking for questions, and especially given that you can keep tweaking your algorithm and your settings until you get an interesting view. You could prove anything if it was considered proof, but instead it's just So I on exactly that note, Monica, if you want to show my screen just for a second. I kept tweaking my settings that I started in the presentation until I got this view, which suggests that in book 15, or rather in the roughly 15th, 17th of the volume, not all the books are the same length, and this is just automatically breaking into 17 parts because this is a levetized version that I didn't break into books. Birds and elephants are barely mentioned at all, but fish are mentioned a lot. So is that book 15 all about fish? I tweaked the settings until it looked like it is, but it also has the word Zoion in there quite a lot, and dogs are mentioned in there a little bit. So this doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything, but it does start to make you think: why are fish mentioned so much and birds almost not at all in this one book? And maybe it's actually half of book 15 and half of book 16, and so it's just random, as Lucia was suggesting earlier, or who knows. Sorry, yeah, but yeah, I think, and I think the same answer with what Monica was saying about fragments. Can we automatically mark fragments of unknown authors and whatever? Simple answer is no, but the more complex answer is yes, but it'll be wrong a certain percentage of the time, and so we have to check every single one. It's still valuable to do so because it gives us things that we might not have spotted otherwise, or it might save us time, or it might make us question things, give us new questions.
Okay, so our time is over, unfortunately. Also for our audience, I know that technically it's 6:45 p.m. Central European time. But anyway, this discussion was very interesting. And today we also have the pleasure to have two guests with a lot of experience and expertise in this field. But anyway, unfortunately, we have to finish. But you have the slides, you have the class outline, and I'm sure that we will definitely talk again about all these issues in Sunoikis Digital Classics, because this is one of the things we are working on. So next week we will have our third session. Our colleague Paolo Monella from the University of Roma La Sapienza will talk about encoding pre-modern writing systems. So we'll talk again about historical documents, historical languages, with a focus on a writing system and written text, and also problems of character encoding. Again, you have the class outline in GitHub, and again, we will see next Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Central European Summer Time. So I thank you all, I thank the audience, and of course a big thank you to our guests, Lucia and Aurélien, for their questions and for enriching our discussion. Okay, so that's it. Thank you again, and see you. Good night. Bye-bye.